Good evening. My name is Turner Bitton. I'm the executive director here at Westview Media. We're back for our third installment of our Candid Candidates series tonight. We're joined by David Damschen, who's the incumbent state treasurer, for our conversation tonight. For those that are watching along live here tonight, I would remind you that you can submit your questions in the comments of the live stream on Facebook, and I'll be sure to ask them. For questions that are very similar, what I'll do is paraphrase them and make sure that I ask them to David. Just a couple of housekeeping items. The last thing that I'd like to remind everyone is that these events are recorded and that they are done live. We will post the recording within just a few days. And if you have follow-up questions, we'll be sure to make sure to ask for contact information toward the end. But with that, I'd like to welcome you, David. Thank you so much for taking time with us tonight.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Turner. Thanks for doing this. Appreciate you committing so much time and energy to this effort.
Absolutely. So why don't you start by just telling us a bit about yourself? How long have you been the state treasurer, and kind of how did you get involved?
Sure. How far back should I go? I started at Boise State when I initially started going to college, and I was an honors English student, and decided after a year I wasn't really into college. Enlisted in the Coast Guard, served 4 years in the U.S. Coast Guard. After that, I returned to school, graduated from the University of Washington with a degree in finance, and I started an almost 20-year banking industry career in Seattle and Portland. And that ended up taking me eventually into institutional treasury management and institutional investments. There are these divisions within national banks that focus on large corporations, large governments that do very large volumes of various types of transactions. And they have to use a lot of specialized technology in terms of affecting the transactions in the first place, controlling fraud along the way, et cetera. So I've kind of grown up as a treasury nerd, really. And my clientele included like Starbucks, Boise Cascade, Albertsons, but also the state of Utah. And I had worked on a couple of pretty major projects with the Treasurer's Office and the state's Division of Finance like 20 years ago, a couple of technology initiatives. And so I knew my predecessor, Richard Ellis, the former state treasurer, and his predecessor. I had worked with them and others at the state on a couple of projects. And so back in 2008, my predecessor was elected. He invited me to join him as his chief deputy, and I came into the office in 2009 as the chief deputy state treasurer with him. And a lot of what I had done in the banking industry translated perfectly. A lot of what I was exposed to in terms of state government and the players and the terminology, a lot of it was very new. And so, but it's been fantastic. I've been in the office now for 11 years. I was chief deputy for 7. My predecessor was appointed to run the state's 529 college savings plan. And so he resigned the office late 2015. I was appointed to replace him at the end of 2015. Immediately had to run for re-election in 2016, having never run for nor held an elected office in my life. And so 2016 was an interesting year. And so I've been treasurer for about 4.5 years. And it's a fantastic job. And I guess that's in a nutshell how I got to be here. And gosh, where do I go from there? A lot of folks, it's been interesting watching the gubernatorial races and people talking about their presumption that our good current Lieutenant Governor Spencer Cox, will just by default, follow precisely in the footsteps of his predecessor. That's really not a good assumption. When you've been there and working under and with someone else's agenda, you start hatching ideas along the way. Not that your predecessors, there's anything wrong with what your predecessor is doing, but you're like, I think I would do that differently. And if you have enough time to observe those things from the sidelines a little bit or working alongside someone, you start developing, an agenda. And so it's been gratifying. It's been a lot of fun to come in after my predecessor was. I used to tell people he's the best state treasurer we could ever possibly have, and I still believe that. He's fantastic. But it's been fun to come in and apply and try some of the things that I wanted to, and bring about some significant beneficial changes along the way.
Well, thank you. I should have said this at the beginning, but if I am looking away from you, it's not because I'm not paying attention. I have two screens that I bounce back and forth with. So the next question is, what do you, in your opinion, what's the most important role that the state treasurer plays?
Well, it's defined in the Constitution. The treasurer is a custodian of public monies, and that's interpreted pretty broadly. Now, obviously, I don't control the money that's administered by your county or your city, right? But those monies, the banking and investment of that money is governed by the state's Money Management Act. And so I have a lot of influence as treasurer in not only what's in the Money Management Act. I've helped run legislation about 7 or 8 times to amend the Money Management Act, because as you know, as everyone knows, the banking industry, the economy, the financial markets have been changing pretty significantly over the past decade. And so we have to go in and periodically amend that statute to help modernize things and ensure that we have a statute that's functional for this evolving landscape in the banking and investment marketplace. But also very significantly, I do arrange for all of the banking contracts for all state agencies. So all taxpayer money administered at the state level is under the administration of the treasurer in terms of those banking contracts. Now, state agencies, they administer money, they disperse funds, they collect money for the various things that they do. I don't have control over that, but I provide them with the tools and the resources to do the banking. But also very significantly, we run a state investment pool. Most states have this. They call them local government investment pools. So our pool in Utah is about $18 billion. So again, your city, your county, your school district, pretty much every governmental entity in the state has at least one account with us in this investment pool. And most treasurers of cities, towns, et cetera, they don't have an extensive background in institutional investments. And so if they're looking at reserve funds of the school district or University of Utah, whatever, they may or may not want to go out and try to invest and to ensure that they're doing so in compliance with the Money Management Act. So we're sort of a safe harbor. They can say, well, we'll send it to the treasurer. That pool is very low cost. It's very well diversified. It's very high performing. And that's why we have $18 billion in that pool. Most local governments say, I don't really want to get on the phone with the broker and buy and sell short-term money market securities. It's not my expertise. Let's have the treasurer do it. So custodian of public monies is by far and away the most important role of the treasurer. And that really, the rubber hits the road primarily through that investment pool and through our oversight of the Money Management Act. I have a seat with the Money Management Council that oversees the local government banking and investing. Local governments are required to twice yearly send a deposit and investment report to the Money Management Council. And one of the folks that works out of my office is actually staff to the council, but she reports to me. And we administer the database of those deposit and investment reports. And so we have indirectly an oversight role and responsibility in partnership with that Money Management Council, just to kind of keep an eye on banking and investment practices of local governments. And then the other connection that I have with local governments is more informal. I'm out there with the Utah League of Cities and Towns, the Utah Association of Counties, Utah Association of Public Treasurers, school business officials, speaking to them periodically on banking technology, public investments, the Money Management Act, anytime there are changes to the Money Management Act. And then we also run public finance symposiums every several years, and that's focusing more on debt management practices for those local governments that are out there issuing bonds to finance infrastructure and so forth. We'll go out and help to train local governments to help them be compliant, not only with state law, but with federal tax code and with federal securities related laws that tie to the issuing of bonds for public infrastructure.
Thank you. So it seems like you have quite the full plate. So I'd like to kind of break it down into some different chunks. But before we get into specifics, what made you decide to take the leap into public service? Was there a defining moment, or was it just a new opportunity?
Having been in the banking industry for almost 20 years, most of what I did was client relationship management, relationship development, business development, sales management type of a thing. And I always felt that it would be really intriguing to be a practitioner, so to speak, instead of a provider of technology solutions and someone who worked with those in the trenches. I always had a desire to be a practitioner at some point. Really, when the treasurer, when my predecessor asked me to join him, the banking industry was struggling. This is like 2008, right? I was not looking to make a change. My focus was helping the bank that I worked for survive. But when my predecessor came to me, I knew him well, and I knew him to be a phenomenal finance professional and a friend. And the opportunity to work with him and to serve the public in the Office of State Treasurer was very compelling. And so the timing was very good. It was a great time, frankly, to take a break from the banking industry. And it was a great opportunity to work with a consummate professional and friend who helped kind of teach me the ropes in terms of state government. And the one area that we deal with intensively that I lacked the most background in was that debt management side of things, assembling underwriters and going out to the public municipal debt market, issuing bonds and structuring those transactions, and managing the compliance and the accounting that's associated with all of that. That was entirely new to me, but my predecessor, that was his relative strength. He had a great background in that area. So it was also a great opportunity for me to come in and get involved in aspects of Treasury that I hadn't really done that much prior. Most of my focus previously, again, had been on the institutional investment side, institutional trust and custody, and the Treasury management, the payment technology and digital commerce type stuff.
Thank you. So I'm going to just kind of dive into some of the specifics of your office. But first, I know you're a constitutional officer, but does the treasurer work for the governor, or are you?
Oh, that's so funny. I had somebody recently say, "Oh, I see you're going to get a new boss next year," and I said, "No, I'm not going to get a new boss." I will tell you with great pride that my attitude is the best way that I serve my constituents is I work constructively with my fellow elected officials, and so it's really, really important to me to build and maintain strong working relationships with the governor, the attorney general, legislators, and that's where I invest a lot of my time and energy. And I do not work for the governor, but I work very constructively with the governor and his team. And Governor Herbert has a great team. And yes. Did I answer that question correctly?
Yeah.
Okay.
We can pull out our state constitution and double check.
Yeah.
As you mentioned just a few moments ago, the treasurer's office oversees just a wide litany of different projects. So to talk specifically about investments for a second, can you just explain that process? You mentioned reserve funds and cities working with you. For folks that are watching, they may not know what reserve funds are and kind of how that works. So are you
Sure.
taking funding from cities and investing it, or how does that process work?
This is such a good question, Turner, because I've had people, when I've said, yeah, we run this pool and there's billions of dollars, $18 billion. I've had people say, you're sitting on $18 billion of taxpayer money. That makes, I'm a taxpayer. That makes me mad. Well, realize that every school district in the state that's gone out and issued bonds to build a new school, when they receive the money from issuing those bonds, they have to put that somewhere. And so a lot of what we're investing, take the Salt Lake Airport. I think we know that we're building this incredible new airport that is costing, I think in total, like $4 billion or something. Well, when Salt Lake City Corporation goes out and issues bonds, they're issuing bonds $1 billion at a time. And they don't put every single dollar of that into the pool with us, but they put a big slug of it. And so you replicate that across the state, University of Utah, Salt Lake City, Salt Lake County, all the school districts. Some of that money is bond proceeds. When I say operating reserves, that's money that's not in your checking account. So for you personally, you have your emergency savings and, money that's set aside that you don't need to keep in the checking to pay the bills. That's an operating reserve. That's what we expect to have. Now this pool, it's important to note, this pool provides daily liquidity. So if you're Salt Lake City and you call me tomorrow and say, hey, we need $75 million today, we can deliver that. And that's actually been a big focus for us here in the COVID context. Of course, this COVID scenario has changed life for a lot of people. We were very concerned about the potential for local governments to have extraordinary needs for liquidity because the nature of this crisis, of course, was a liquidity event. It wasn't like what happened in 2008. It was very, very different. It was a total stoppage of financial markets and transactions. Well, it happens that the Federal Reserve and Congress, with what actions they took, very effectively restored functioning to the market, although it was a little bumpy there in March and April. A big focus for us since March and since COVID started has been building liquidity in that pool. Is before the crisis, before this all happened, of that $18 billion, we were probably maintaining maybe $1 billion in daily liquidity. And so we've now built it to about $4 billion. So that's our primary investment operation. We have about $500 million in other miscellaneous long horizon investment funds. And then also for me personally, I serve on 2 boards that are intensively investment related. I'm on the Utah Retirement Systems Board, and that is that's the state's pension system, and that's police, fire, teachers, state employees, local government employees. It's all in that one system. It's about a $34 billion pension system, and there's another, I want to say, 4, 5, 6 billion in defined contribution assets. So I'm on that board. I chair their audit committee. And then there's a school and institutional trust fund office. When the state was created in the Enabling Act, Congress very paternalistically said, hey, we're going to designate these chunks of land within the state that are granted into 12 trusts, one for the common schools or the public school system, one for Miners Hospital, one for a school for the deaf and blind, et cetera, okay, reservoirs. Well, those lands are managed over time. Some of them are leased for oil and gas extraction. Some of them are sold, traded, developed, et cetera. They're monetized over time. And so from that land over time, we built a $2.5 billion investment portfolio. It's a school and institutional trust fund office, and I chair the board that oversees that office. And that like the Utah Retirement System, is a very complex multi-asset class, long horizon investment portfolio. And so I have investment focus that's within my office and then as a board member with those 2 other organizations as part of state government.
Thank you. So speaking a little bit of SITLA, which is the School Lands Trust that you were talking about, what responsibility do you have there, just as a board member, or do you oversee any funds for them?
Okay. I keep thinking, how do I do the Reader's Digest version? Okay, so SITFO, the School and Institutional Trust Fund Office, is the money, the monetized part. SITLA is the land administration. For decades, SITLA didn't exist. It was a land board, state land board that administered those land. And over time, there have been great efforts made by Mel Brown, Margaret Bird, others to improve and optimize the management of those assets, both land and investments. And so part of that system has had a beneficiaries representative. And historically, the beneficiaries representative, this is someone that's just kind of watching out for the school kids and the universities and those that are the beneficiaries of these trusts that will receive that money ultimately. For many years, that beneficiaries representative was an office called the Children's Trust Section within the State Board of Education. But a couple of years ago, a bill was run creating a new office called the Land Trusts Protection and Advocacy Office. And that office has a two-pronged oversight system, one prong being a committee and the other prong being the treasurer. So because of that, the Land Trust Protection and Advocacy Office and Committee has direct oversight relationship with SITLA. I'm not a lands administration guy, so you wouldn't really want me having much of an active role overseeing SITLA, but I oversee this beneficiary's representative jointly with his committee who oversees SITLA. And so since that occurred a couple of years ago, I've been trying to attend SITLA board meetings when I'm able. I'm on 19 boards and commissions by law. I'm on one additional board by choice, that's junior achievement, based on our activities in consumer financial literacy. Junior achievement's very closely aligned with other things that we do in my office for consumer financial literacy. So, so I don't make it to all of the SITLA board meetings that I want to, but I know that if I'm going to be supportive of and meaningfully overseeing to the Land Trust Protection Advocacy Office, got to have a fair handle on what's going on at SITLA. So I have indirect oversight relationship with SITLA, but it's very indirect.
Thank you. And I'm just going to give you a break for a second and just remind folks that are watching live, if you have questions, please submit them in the chat function, and I'll be sure to ask them. To move on to a little bit of a different topic, the debt management side of things. So you talked about the issuance of bonds. If you wouldn't mind, would you explain what that process looks like and for watchers?
You bet. And there's several different components I want to touch on. When the legislature decides that, hey, we're going to build this new prison like we are, or we're going to drop another $1 billion in I-15 in Utah County, some of that's going to be paid for through appropriations of the legislature. Some of it's going to be borrowed. So when it's going to be borrowed, the legislature actually passes a bill authorizing the borrowing of the issuance of this debt. So when it comes time that whenever UDOT says, okay, we're ready, we need some money for the coming year's construction, I meet up with UDOT and say, okay, we have legal authorization from the legislature for $1 billion. How much do you need for the coming year? Oh, we only need 400 million. We generally go to market roughly once a year as needed. There are times when we might not go to the market and issue bonds for a year or two or three, which is good. We pay down whatever debt is already outstanding. If you look at a long history of the state's debt, you do see it's cyclical. You have times when debt runs up and then we pay it down, it runs up, we pay it down. So when the legislature authorizes the issuance of general obligation debt, then I work with state agencies that are responsible for spending that money and getting the construction done. And I go to the market and ensure that borrowing process is as efficient and as low cost as possible, because it's one of the most important ways that I can reduce the burden the taxpayers bear. And there's a lot of nuance in that. There's method of sale, there's syndicate rules if you're going to use a syndicate of underwriters on a larger transaction. There's ways of boosting retail, the participation of retail investors in the transaction, et cetera. So that's when my office leads the process of issuing bonds. And then also we're responsible for market disclosure. It's called post-issuance compliance. There's certain things that you have to do from a disclosure standpoint as well as a tax standpoint to comply with market rules, to also comply with agreements that you've made with your investors as far as here's the information that we'll put out every year, and so forth. And so we oversee that process of market disclosure. And then also there's a couple of things that we do related to debt that are a little bit different. We are a conduit. Okay, let me back up. One of my boards and commissions is the Utah Charter School Finance Authority. I serve as chair of the Utah Charter School Finance Authority. The Charter School Finance Authority is a conduit issuer of bonds. That just means that charter schools can't issue bonds on their own. They're 501c3 nonprofits. but they can come to a governmental entity, and they don't have to use the authority. Most of them do now, but they can use a city or a county or whatever, but they need a governmental entity to issue tax-exempt bonds on their behalf. And then the bonds are issued, and the proceeds, the money that comes from that bond issue, are loaned to the charter schools. And so we do a lot with charter school bonds, and we also administer a charter school credit enhancement program that just puts a certain type of backing of the state behind those bonds to help bring the interest rate down to, it basically enhances the quality of the bonds, reduces the interest rate, and therefore the cost that the charter schools incur. And similarly, we administer a school bond guarantee program because school districts, of course, are entirely governmental. We're actually able to do an outright guarantee of school district bonds. Utah is one of only like 11 or 12 states that are rated AAA by all three rating agencies. When we provide a school district with a guarantee of their bonds, that school district receives the very same AAA bond rating that the state itself has. So we're saving school districts tons of money as well, because they're getting the lowest interest rates possible. There's nothing better than AAA. And so we issue bonds, but we also get involved in the credit enhancement of certain charter school bonds as well as school district bonds.
Thank you. So you've mentioned a couple of times that when the legislature creates general obligation bonds or authorizes them, and you've mentioned the legislature in a couple of different capacities. So what exactly does your relationship with the legislature look like as the treasurer?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, like I said before, it's very important to me that I work constructively with elected officials, because we're all here to solve problems for our constituents. And if we don't have good working relationships, open channels of communication, we're impaired in that regard. And so I spend a lot of time building relationships with legislators. I provide them with an overview of our office. Honestly, legislators, you could be in the legislature, obviously, and maybe someday you will. And legislators don't necessarily know any more about the office of state treasurer than anyone else unless I tell them. And so we have an office overview that we do with legislators when they're new coming in, so that they know all the things that we're responsible for, and they know when they're dealing with subject matter that I might be able to help them with, right? It's like, hey, if people are asking you or hitting you up about the state's retirement system or public pension, I'm on that board. Give me a call, I'll help you out. Legislators might be running legislation where they can use my help. There was a bill a couple of years ago run by the Taxpayers Association, and in a nutshell, it was trying to, there was a loophole in the law that certain local governments were taking advantage of to borrow millions of dollars more than voters had authorized. And they said, this is this complicated, arcane municipal bond stuff, and we can't explain it as well as you can. Can you help us? And I looked at it and said, well, yes, we can help explain it, number one. And number two, that's one of the clearest cases of right and wrong I've ever seen. So we were asked to help. This is not a common thing, but it'll happen from time to time. But we were asked to help to educate legislators on this, and that bill passed. In other cases, I'll identify something that needs to change in the law related to banking or investments or what else? It's usually, or bonding. I ran a bill in the 2020 session that had like 3 separate things. It addressed municipal bankruptcy for local government. It strengthened incrementally our AAA bond rating by putting explicit language in law that prioritized debt service appropriations above all other appropriations. It's the kind of thing that makes rating agencies feel warm and fuzzy. And the third piece was just some cleanup to plug a gap or two that had been created by prior legislation that didn't recognize the gaps that it was creating. When people complain about the number of bills that get run every session, you've probably heard this, but it's true. A lot of the bills are they're kind of like fine tuning on the margins, and they're plugging gaps from things that maybe more major legislation that was run previously. Probably my most important legislative task has been I ran a complete repeal and replace of the unclaimed property statute. So again, I mentioned I have two agencies. I have the Office of State Treasurer. I have the Unclaimed Property Division. The Unclaimed Property Division, we deal with lost money for businesses and families. And we take in between 40 and $60 million a year in lost money. And we go out and try to get it back to the rightful owners. Well, the unclaimed property statute was a little bit outdated. And there's this group called, a lot of components in state law across the country are promulgated in law as uniform law, right? Maybe you've heard of the Uniform Commercial Code, the UCC. Well, that's states all getting together saying, hey, we have interstate banking, interstate commerce. We need some commonality in big sections of the law. So the Uniform Law Commission got together and created a new, what was called the Revised Uniform Unclaimed Property Act. And I worked with Senator Hilliard and Representative Snow in 2017 to get RUPA passed. And so it was a complete repeal and replace of the state's unclaimed property statute to provide for greater digital security, just to better protect rightful owners of their own properties. It just addressed a number of things that really had to be updated in the law. And this is a great example of that fine-tuning aspect. We ran RUPA, which is this big repeal and replace in 2017. We ran two more bills, one in 2018, one in 2019, to just kind of, fill in a couple of little gaps on the margins. And I think we're done now, but time will tell. But yeah, there's a number of different ways. There was actually a bill that got run in the 2019 session that had some problematic consequences. And I worked really hard to actually oppose and ultimately kill that bill. I don't love getting involved in that. Usually it's best if legislators are talking to various parties and figuring out if something's going to fly or not, kind of a thing, and if it makes sense or not. But every now and then that won't get figured out before the session, and things have to be dealt with during the session. And so a lot of different ways that I'll get involved with legislation.
Thank you. I'm going to circle back on the Unclaimed Property Initiative, because that's the first time that I became aware or that I even heard about the responsibilities of the state treasurer. I almost 10 years ago closed on a house, and I guess part of my closing costs or something that I had paid them ended up as unclaimed property. And anyway, my dad sent me the link and told me to go online and claim it. And I went online and claimed it. And so I'd like if you just take a second to explain that initiative and what unclaimed property is. I know it's in the name, but for folks that are watching that are not familiar with the process.
You bet. Yeah, I'm glad you're asking. The more I can talk about it, the better. I mean, I do it on radio and TV, and we do all that we can to inform people. Some people think it's a scam because, I mean, I'll tell you as a consumer financial advocate that if something sounds too good to be true, it's a scam, right? Mm-hmm. So it sounds too good to be true that there might be money in your name that's, all you have to do is fill out some forms, but it's true. I mean, I've been involved in getting money back to rightful owners in the like $35,000 a pop kind of. I don't know if your situation was that much money, but it's the real deal. So people might have, like what you described, your example was a perfect one. It's possible that a check was mailed to you and it was lost in the mail, or it was mailed to you and it sat on the breakfast bar for a few days and got swept along with the junk mail into the garbage or whatever. Well, whoever wrote that check to you still owes you that money, right? And they're obligated under the law after a certain period of time goes by, several years, to pass that to the state. Because obviously a title company or a bank or businesses, they don't hire people whose job it is to get rid of other people's money that they happen to be sitting on, right? That's not their core mission. And so it is our core mission. And so that money gets passed to the state. It might be bank accounts. Maybe you had a bank account and you moved and you forgot to tell the bank. And so they've lost track of you and they can't get a hold of you. Uncashed checks are a lot of what we see. It could be safe deposit box contents. People pass away and life insurance policies and so forth. There's a lot of different things. So that money is sent to us, and we raise awareness. We tell people it's mycash.utah.gov. So you go to mycash.utah.gov, you can plug in your last name. I tell people, if you will take 20 minutes and plug in names of coworkers, neighbors, family members, friends, mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, everyone you can think of, you're going to find someone that that has lost property, because 1 in 5 Utahns have money with us. And this last year, we haven't put this out publicly yet, but we set a new record in total properties this last year. Again, since I've been around for a few years, I can tell you that going back about 7 or 8 years, we were paying out on the order of 7 or 8 million a year, and we've been squarely in excess of 20 million for like 4 or 5 years running now. And this last year, we actually did better than 40 million. So we just do all that we can to raise awareness, get people come online searching, and then we have a locator function where we try to track people down and get their own money back to them.
Thank you. Mine was not 35,000, but if there's something taken around somewhere, I wouldn't turn it down. So as I was looking at your website before we started tonight, I saw that there were a couple of other initiatives in addition to the unclaimed property that have saved taxpayers some money. Do you want to talk about those as well?
Well, I'm not sure what you're referring to. Were they some of the technology initiatives or?
Technology, and I believe it was payment processing.
Yeah, there's a lot of, the opportunities that we have to reduce the burden that taxpayers feel they're all over the place. Banking efficiency. We implemented a check clearing technology called Image Cash Letter with the tax commission a couple of years ago. Things like that will have 5-figure, 6-figure savings attached to them. We periodically go through a procurement process and bid out different services. We implemented a type of payment technology called e-payables some years ago. And that just involves the use of the credit card system without an actual piece of plastic. And I'm sure you're aware that when you use the credit card system, the merchant that's accepting the payment, they give up like 3% of the transaction. Well, a chunk of that gets shared back to the issuer of the card. Well, if you're the state and you're dispersing millions of dollars over a card platform, that not only doesn't entail cost to the state and therefore taxpayers, but it actually generates income, rebate income. So we look for opportunities like that where we'll take those all day long where we can get them. We have a purchasing card system, the e-payable system, things like that actually provide sources of revenue. And every dollar that we can earn or reduce in cost is one more increment in reduced burden on Utah taxpayers.
Thank you. We got one of our first audience questions, and I hope that I'm not going to mispronounce this name. I believe that it's Sean. But he asks, does the state have like a bank account with like Wells Fargo, or where does the money actually go?
Yeah, that's a good question, Sean. The state has a lot of bank accounts. We have 4 primary banking, as far as what I would call depository banking relationships, okay? We have 4 primary depository banking relationships. We have a bank that's our primary depository and what we call concentration bank. There are technologies that will actually, where you can have multiple accounts where the money will automatically flow to a parent you'll have child accounts and then a parent account, and where the money will just automatically flow to the parent account. So you have separation from an accounting and reconciliation standpoint, but you have a automated concentration of the cash to streamline the cash management process. But that's one of the things that my office does is we actually, every single day, we have a cash manager who comes in the morning. We use a certain technology to know, like, how do you know what checks are going to clear or clear your account? Well, for us as consumers, we log on today to see what cleared yesterday, right? Mm-hmm. Well, we use technology that the banking system can provide that tells us we can go in this morning at 9 and know what checks are going to clear tonight, right? It's a special treasury technology. We've used it for years. So our cash manager will take the money that's come in, and we'll move that money into, we'll fund disbursements to make sure that because our disbursements go out of a separate bank. And then we'll invest a certain amount based on the availability of cash. So we have many bank accounts. That's the depository side. I mentioned the investment pool before. We use a custody bank to basically hold those securities and to provide accounting, compliance, performance measurement, et cetera. A custody bank is where if you're a large institutional investor and you have hundreds of millions of dollars or whatever, you might use multiple brokers, multiple money managers. From a security and a safety and an accounting standpoint, you want to have a single safe repository for all those securities to be held. And that's a custodian or custody bank. So we have a custody bank relationship. We have multiple of those depository accounts. At our disbursement bank alone, we have 25 separate accounts, and a lot of that's delineation by state agency. But we use these zero balance accounts, as I described, and they work both ways. If you cut a check from a zero balance account, it'll pull the money out and it'll pull the money down from the parent account automatically, in the same way that it pushes the money into the parent account if you're receiving funds. So yeah, lots of bank accounts.
And your name is on all the checks, right?
Yes, it is. And I get called from people asking if I can verify, that the funds are good and things like that occasionally. So yeah.
This is a question that came in before we started, and I think this is a good time to ask it. But the question was from someone who works for a nonprofit, I guess in finance, and they receive grants from the federal government, and those grants are paid out via direct deposit. Is that something your office could implement, doing direct deposit for state payments and grants?
Oh, we do gobs of direct, yeah. When I mentioned that I had worked on a couple of projects over 20 years ago, and that's one of the ways, the state was my client, that was one of the projects I worked on is the state already was at that time doing direct deposit for payroll to state employees. The state's done that for years. That's like 1970s technology, and it's very common for people to have electronic payments for payroll. But it's been a little bit slower coming when you look at the complexities involved with business to business accounts payable, where you've got invoices and multiple purchase orders and things like that. But yeah, one of those projects I worked on over 20 years ago was implementing ACH, it's a automated clearinghouse. It was implementing ACH payments for accounts payable at the state. So yeah, not only do we do it, I was involved in implementing it like a long time ago. I'm old ish.
Well, thank you. I haven't seen any new questions come in from the audience, so I'm gonna move to the last two questions, or last three questions, excuse me. So the next one is, I appreciate you taking the time to explain your office and the nitty gritty, but you are running for re-election. So what is, in your opinion, the biggest issue that you hope to tackle if you're reelected?
Oh, that is so hard, because obviously there's many more than one. I would say the biggest priority for me going forward is our investment practice, our in-house investment practice. We're looking to augment what we do now in-house in the treasurer's office with a investment consultant. So there's a procurement process involved in that, and there'll be a little bit of re-engineering of some portfolios, some investment portfolios involved in that. And that's kind of top shelf priority going forward. The other thing, a lot of it's procurement. One of the most important contracts that we have is with what's called a municipal advisor. So when we work on those tax exempt municipal bond issues, we work with the municipal advisor. That contract gets bid out every 5 years, and it's actually out to bid right now. That's very much on the front burner. I know I'm not telling you just one thing. The other thing, I chair the Utah Navajo Trust Fund Board of Trustees, and I've been watching closely how Navajos are impacted by COVID, and we're trying. Navajo Trust Fund, historically, we build homes for Navajos. We extend electricity out to home sites. We fund scholarships for Utah Navajos to go to college and technical school. But we have a fairly broad mandate in the law. And I'm trying to decide, there's a lot of federal funds flowing right now. So a lot of the most immediate needs that are being felt there on the Navajo Nation are being addressed through these CARES Act monies that are being distributed. So we need to be careful and protective of those trust fund monies. We don't want to rush in and try to beat federal money to the cause, right? But there's not just COVID, but really chronically food insecurity issues down there. And so a big focus for me right now is evaluating the food pantries and the mechanisms, relationships between the Utah Food Bank and the food pantries down in San Juan County that serve predominantly Navajos. And I'm just kind of asking myself the question, should the trust fund possibly be involved in enhancing that? As you can imagine, we had issues in the summer with, you may have heard about some of these donations of land, sheep and perishable food items. In the heat of the summer, if you're trying to ship perishable food donations down to San Juan County, and by the time it gets out to a chapter house, and then from the chapter house to the recipient's home, it might not be usable anymore. And so a big question for me is, how beneficial might it be to look at commercial grade refrigerator, freezer type infrastructure, things like that, just to better facilitate better storage and delivery of donated food items to a population that is, significantly food insecure and much worse so in the COVID context. So, yeah. Sorry, I didn't give you just one answer.
No, that was great. Thank you very much. I did have one other question come in by text message as you were talking. So this will be the last audience question. Folks, you can still submit them, and I will either work with David to get them answered, or we'll provide contact information at the end. But the question that came in is, who sets the investment priorities? And they explained further by saying, if we say wanted the state to only invest in clean energy, or we only wanted it kind of these ESG funds, is that something you would make the decision on, or does the legislature make that decision?
Yeah, that's a good question. Most of what I manage within my office is operating funds, the state investment pool, and there's not a lot of ESG to that. There could be. We could say, well, we're not going to buy short-term securities issued by Exxon or whatever. But in my view, it would be entirely inappropriate for the legislature to weigh on that. The Money Management Act lays out what's legal for us to do. There's a little bit of a debate around whether or not you violate your fiduciary obligation when you follow ESG approaches. And I think it's sound practice to consider sustainability, governance, those kinds of things when you're looking at investing. But take Utah retirement systems. You really need to leave it to the full-time, very well-educated, very experienced investment staff to exercise, under the policy set out by the board, to exercise that fiduciary obligation and to apply their expertise to the management of those investments. So there are situations where folks say, hey, we really don't think the state should be investing in this or that. I think here in Utah, where we're pretty conservative, we stay away from those kinds of limitations, but in some cases they're very appropriate. When you look at terrorist nations and that kind of a thing, I mean, there are going to be limitations already in terms of what we would invest in if you're getting into those kinds of conflicts or potential concerns. ESG is a whole nother discussion unto itself, but I'll say that ESG considerations are important to consider but you cannot let ESG considerations trump your fiduciary obligation to invest in um, components of a portfolio that will best serve the beneficiaries, be they pensioners or state agencies or whatever, whomever you're investing for.
Yeah. And I imagine a risky bet would potentially destabilize an investment and not get the kind of return that you need.
Yeah, well, and bear in mind, like a lot of the worst shock in March and April was felt by the energy sector. And I received a very unusual inquiry from a financial publication that they rarely would call and ask about the investments of our state investment pool. And they called and asked about our energy investments. And they're moderate. As we've gone through the process of letting securities mature to build up that liquidity that I mentioned, we have about 4 billion out of 18. Now, as we want to try to rebuild some investments, maybe reduce liquidity a bit, now we're going out to the market. It's fairly slim pickings because with this overhang of economic weakness, companies and all-time low interest rates, companies either aren't going to borrow because there's a deficit in demand, or because rates are so low, if they choose to borrow, they'll borrow longer term. And we can't go longer than 3 years on floating rate securities or 15 months on fixed rate securities. And we ran into this problem back in the 2008, 2009, 2010 timeframe. Rates are super low. Corporations, they're either not borrowing, or if they do borrow, they borrow mostly long term. The point I'm making is right now, if I look back the last few weeks at what opportunities do we have to invest in higher grade securities where we can even get securities into our portfolio that can maybe help bring a little bit of yield back to the portfolio after we built all this liquidity up that hurts yield. There have been some energy issuers, and my investment officer said, "Hey, how do you feel about," I think it was Exxon or Chevron. I said, a small incremental allocation of Chevron's not going away. Exxon's not going away. So it would be very damaging to taxpayers if we somehow woke up one day and said, we won't support oil and gas. Well, in this market environment, within the last couple of weeks, that was about the only game in town to pick up higher rated securities that could, better serve our taxpayers' interests. So that's the dilemma that you face is, I have an ultimate fiduciary obligation to take really good care as a steward of my taxpayers' financial interests. And so it's a great question. It's a great question.
Thank you. So the last question that I'm going to ask you before we close up is there any issue or any question I should have asked you that I haven't tonight?
Oh boy. Not that I can think of. You didn't ask me, are you a skier?
I am a snowboarder.
Okay.
Not a terrible one.
Yeah. Usually, I mean, it's important to, so I'm on the ski patrol at Powder Mountain. So you haven't asked me, have you ever skied at Powder Mountain?
I have. Powder Mountain's my favorite.
Really? Okay. Well, you need to come and see me this winter. I don't know if that's a question you should have asked per se, but you should definitely come up and we'll go. I'm so sad how abruptly our ski season ended this last season, right? It's just all of a sudden, all the resorts had to close down. And so I'm like most people looking forward to the coming ski season for sure.
Yeah. Well, I'll definitely take you up on that. And I'd like to give you a chance for just an exit statement or closing statement if you'd like to. And if you would let people know how to contact you, that would be another good thing to include.
You bet. So closing statement. Well, it's just a huge honor and privilege to serve Utah as state treasurer. It's a sacred charge to be the steward of taxpayer resources. And it's self-serving for me to say this, but I would point back to everything we've talked about here and say experience in this realm matters a lot. It's very complicated what we do. And I have a great team and I love what I'm doing, and we strive for perfection. knowing that we'll never reach it, but there's always room for improvement. I have focused very heavily on improving business processes and implementing technologies. I think that Utah taxpayers want someone like me who comes from industry and the private sector. When I come into office, as some of the gubernatorial candidates said, bring that fresh perspective and implement best practices that you have worked with. What are the good things that you did for Starbucks or Albertsons? Can you do those things for the state? That's my approach. You know, can we implement processes and technologies that keep us in the realm of best practice? And when we're doing that, we're constantly becoming more efficient. We're doing more and more with less. And we're looking for ways in all ways that we can to reduce the burden that taxpayers bear. And that's what the job's all about for me. And like I said, solving constituent problems. And so that's it in a nutshell. My email address is dcdamschen@gmail.com, dcdamschen@gmail.com. And my phone number is 801-554-7143.
I will put that in the chat for those that are watching if you have additional questions. And I'd just like to thank you so much for taking the time tonight. And if you have exciting initiatives after this crazy election season and you'd like to come back, we can always do a town hall with our elected officials on any initiatives you have going on.
Well, I appreciate it, Turner. It's been great talking to you. I appreciate, again, the commitment that you've made. It's, you know, keeping the level of accessibility and accountability and transparency around government is a huge task, and appreciate your contribution to that. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you. You take care and good luck in your election, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care.
Thanks, Turner. You too.
Bye-bye.